So, hello, Mr. Griffin. First of all, I would like sincerely thank you for you have accepted our interview invitation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. And at the same time, I would like to give some information about you to our Azerbaijani local and at the same time worldwide audience about your personality, about your activity. Mr. Roger Griffin, Roger David Griffin is a British professor of modern history and political theorist at Oxford Brookes University, England. His principal interest is the socio-historical and ideological dynamics of fascism, as well as various forms of political and religious fanaticism. Griffin obtained first in French and German literature from Oxford University, then began teaching history of ideas at Oxford Polytechnic, now Oxford Brookes, becoming interested in the study of extremist right-wing movements and regimes which have shaped modern history. Griffin obtained a PhD from Oxford University in 1990. He first developed his palingenesis theory of fascism in his PhD thesis. His best-known work is The Nature of Fascism that was published by you, Mr. Griffin, in 1991, if I don't confuse, if I remember right. In May 2011, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Leuven in recognition of his services to the comparative study of fascism. So, Mr. Griffin, again, thank you so much. And that is great honor and pleasure of mine to interview as such specialist in the sphere as you are. If you don't mind, I will directly switch onto our questions.
That's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So, it's common knowledge that today the words terrorism and extremism are familiar to very big, enormous audiences worldwide. So we remember the events of 11/9 and 2001 when the Twin Towers were crushed during that terrorist act in the United States in Manhattan. So in aftermath of that event, in aftermath of that terroristic act, the words terror and terrorist have become so common among the population worldwide. So we are going to talk a bit about what is going on now, about the situation in the sphere today. So the very first question of mine will be, how do you, as the being specialist in the sphere, define modern international extremism and terrorism?
Yeah. Well, the problem there is you're asking an expert, and when an expert has a question, instead of giving a simple answer, they give complicated answers because it's people without specialist knowledge that have simple answers. So if you want a simple answer, never ask an academic. Both those words, extremism and terrorism, are very problematic, as we say. They defy simple definitions. Extremism, if you think about the word, is always relative to a center. Now, that center may be in a functioning liberal democracy, a social democracy with no torture or oppression or persecution, such as, say, modern Finland or modern New Zealand, but it may be the center is that of an autocratic state like Iran or China or North Korea. And if the center is extreme, as it were, then obviously some of the people who want human rights will be called extreme. So extremism is always relative to a center. And therefore it's a pretty vague and nebulous and useless word to fix to people. And Putin's Russia applies the word extreme to people like Navalny, who just want basic human rights. And Iran attaches it to women who want to be able to not have control of their bodies and what they wear. So basically, it is a problematic term, and it's very easy for it to be used in a way that demonizes, that stigmatizes, that basically dehumanizes the people it's attached to, especially when it's used by a political state. As for terrorism, well, again, terrorism simply applies to a tactic of using mass violence or acts of violence to change the status quo, to change the situation. Now, from that point of view, you could say that the French Revolution was terroristic and that the Russian Revolution was terroristic. And in fact, if you look at the history of the use of the word, the Nazis used words terror about anybody protesting against the Third Reich. So terrorism is very easy to use in a very loose way. And one of its problems is that it can be used about individuals trying to do something that any humanistic person or religious person who is not fanatical would regard as something good. So, for example, in the present situation in Israel, it's very easy for the right wing in Israel, the Netanyahu faction, to see the struggle of Palestinians to achieve decent human lives as terroristic. Now, Hamas and Hezbollah may be terroristic, but to see the Palestinian struggle as terroristic is a deeply disturbing misuse of the term, and it ignores the existence of state terror. And state terror has killed and tortured and destroyed far more people than anti-state terror in modern history. And if you think of, again, contemporary autocracies such as North Korea and Iran and Syria under al-Assad and certainly modern China and modern Russia, if you think of all those millions of people living under those states, they are all the victims of state terror, except that the state will use the word terrorism about everybody trying to create a sustainable human life or a sustainable planet. So China persecutes democratic supporters throughout China, and especially in Hong Kong. So in fact, what I'm giving you is a non-answer. I think you have to see these terms as having very particular meanings in very particular situations, and you need a lot of knowledge about the threats to human freedom, human dignity, and human life before you can use them with any accuracy. I don't know how you respond to that sort of complicated answer.
I'm sorry, Mr. Griffin, I have not got this question on my list, but as soon as you have touched the French Revolution, a new question have come. So one more question I would like to address you. That is not on my list, by the way.
Okay.
Could we claim in this case, I have seen that you have got enormous knowledge, not only in all those spheres that are defining your specialization, but at the same time in history, you have just claimed that you have just touched some aspect of Great French Revolution. So in this case, could we claim that after French Revolution, individuals' terrorism have been transformed into state-level terrorism?
Yeah. Well, actually, that would be an interesting argument. But actually, if you think of the history of the state throughout history, if you think of the Egyptian state or the Roman state or the Mongol state or whatever state you like, the Christian states in the early modern period, if you think of they all used state.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah,
They all used,
even previous times.
yes, Oh, absolutely. The state has always been autocratic historically. I cannot think of a non-autocratic state in ancient times. Even Greek democracy was based on slavery, and some would argue that the democratic freedoms were enjoyed by a small elite. So it's very problematic to say when terrorism started. But certainly, if you want to think of the modern word, I mean, the word became extremely well known in history in a particular episode of the French Revolution, which was called La Terreur, the terror. And that was not the anti-absolute state violence of the original revolutionaries against the Louis XVI, and the destruction of the Bastille. And of course, they would have been called terrorists by the Ancien Régime. Possibly, though they might not have used that word. Yeah. But Robespierre and the Jacobins used the guillotine as an instrument of state terror against people who they believed were not revolutionary enough. And in a way, if I had to give a lecture on this to students rather than write a book for academics, I would probably have some slides of the French Revolution, because it's a convenient starting point, which illustrates the ambiguity of the term. On the one hand, we have revolutionaries using terror tactics to destroy the Ancien Régime, and we then have non-elected leaders of a democratic regime, or a regime trying to become democratic, using terror in order to promote what they called virtue. The guillotine was an instrument of spreading virtue in society. And for me, that is already a modern perversion of language and a modern example of state terror, where terror and violence is euphemized and turned into positives at the expense of ordinary people. So all I'm really saying to your viewers and listeners is that these words have to be used with great caution. They are not simple words to apply to, and they nearly always involve political judgments and political ideologies and belief systems. So there's no neutral or objective use of these words. Is that fairly clear?
Sir, the next question of mine will be associated what is going on now, today. Let's switch on to these modern advanced technologies.
Yeah.
What role have modern technologies and social networks, maybe media, played in the rise of extremism and terrorism on the global stage today?
Well, again, if don't ask an academic a simple question, because you will get a complicated answer. The causation of extremism and terrorism and state terror, and I'm going to keep putting state terror into this list because it's all too easy to ignore the role of state terror, which is, for example, happening in Gaza today, and it's a terror used by a democratic state which has elected an extremist party. It's a really scary example of how difficult these categories are. But modern technologies and social networks have had an instrumental role in both. I mean, in the 19th century, communications between terrorists or extremists was quite difficult. So you needed pamphlets, you needed publications. They didn't even have phone possibilities. What did you do if you were an anarchist? What did you do if you were a religious fanatic? And also the capacity to commit terror attacks was also very limited. I mean, the invention of dynamite was very important, and of bombs, modern bombs. So you have, for example, the assassination of a Russian Tsar by a small terrorist group, but they had very limited possibilities of either communicating or of committing terrorist attacks. Now, of course, we have everything right up to dirty atomic bombs in the hands of terrorists, and we have extraordinary ease of communication through social media and platforms such as Telegram and Chan8 and various other ones, which are used to communicate between people all over the world. So the technology of both violence and of communication has massively changed the capacity of extremism and terrorism to commit acts of violence, and of course of state terror to commit acts of violence. But it's also, yeah, go on. Yeah.
One more thing that will be, I think that will be associated with the previous question of mine, and at the same time will be newest topic. So how do political, economic, and social factors contribute to the radicalization of youth in different parts of the world? So this is also, I think, very significant side of the problem.
Yeah, well, again, it's very difficult to evaluate this. And I think, again, we have to, one of the great dangers for journalists and academics is to generalize, you see. I think you have to look at each society very closely. For example, if you think of the radicalization of religious youth, and I'm thinking particularly of Islamic youth, to create what we call Islamism, then the main factors are not economic or social. Well, they are social, but they're not economic particularly, but they are to do with identity. They're to do with problems of a sense that you're belonging to a religious community or a societal community is somehow being threatened or crushed by the host nation. So, for example, in England, it's not so much poverty that's driving some young Muslims into radicalization, but the general fact that they're living in a post-Christian society, which is not dominantly Islamic. And unless they become part of a healthy Islamic subculture with a mosque and a community in Britain, which is quite possible, they can fall out of that and they can start becoming radicalized and identifying with Muslims in the Middle East or Muslims in Gaza or groups of Muslims in other countries that they see as tyrannized. And if you then turn away from religious radicalization and think about right-wing, if you like, fascist or extreme right-wing radicalization amongst young people, then a major factor is played again by the need to belong. The fact that some young people, especially in economically deprived areas, feel a deep hatred and resentment of what we call in English otherness, of people they regard as other or foreign or alien.
The idea of otherness.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Do I need to explain that concept? It's a very important concept. That, for example, I'll give you a small example. This summer, there was a murder of 3 people in Britain, and somebody tweeted on social media that they'd been killed by Muslim migrants, and this launched a massive wave of destruction in various cities, which involved thousands of police and attacks on asylum centers. And actually, it turned out that this was a complete lie. The murders were not at all committed by migrants or by Muslims or whatever. But it triggered this wave of hatred and terror committed by quite ordinary people, just people with no record of violence or belonging to terrorist organizations, but of extreme violence, a massive explosion of hatred, which shows that simmering under the surface of fairly stable Western democracies, there's a great potential for a wave of hatred. Now, this is not politically articulated hatred. This is pure violence. This isn't fascism. It's not actually terrorism. Both of those need a lot of ideology and planning. This was a spontaneous social breakdown which caused deep scars in communities. So I think that if you look at the root causes of the radicalization of people who belong to religious communities and the radicalization of non-religious people in Western democracies, they both come down to the crisis of meaning, the crisis of community, the crisis of identity, what sociologists call anomie, of not belonging, of not having a sense of self, which is an epidemic, a pandemic in the modern world. Millions of young people all over the world, and you'll find equivalents in India and in Thailand, etc., etc. But it'll take a different form according to the country, the habitat in which they're living. So these factors do contribute to radicalization, but they play a very different role in different societies. And there are deeper factors about the need to belong, the need for meaning, the need to have a sense of purpose and identity, which are basic human issues, which are not satisfied by modernity. Modern society, even being on social media, etc., does not really fulfill the human need for belonging and love and beauty and a sense of purpose, which used to be supplied sometimes healthily by religion and culture. And those religions and cultures have now been massively affected by modernity. And that has created millions of disaffected young people looking for a spiritual home. And that lostness can be very easily translated into either self-destructive habits like drugs and various forms of addiction, or into fanatical hatred and violence.
So, Mr. Griffin, regarding to our next question, could we say that in this case, hearing and you have expressed all those factors associated with the religion too, so in this case, could we claim that terrorism is not always associated with the religion, and the religion does not always play a key role in radicalization of the society?
Yeah, absolutely. In the light of what I've been trying to say before, if a society has an established and intact religion, still basically part of the norm of society, whether that society is Hindu or Buddhist. I mean, take, for example, Myanmar. Myanmar is a military dictatorship, but it's still Buddhist enough for Buddhism to actually, and the same was true in Sri Lanka in the war against the Hindus in northern Sri Lanka. Where religion is still an intact institution and cultural practice, then extremism will take on a religious form. Now, I don't believe that any religion can be genuinely terroristic or violent. It's just that the violence and terror expresses itself in religious terms. In other words, I don't believe that Islamism is genuine Islam, and I hope that Judaism is not the Judaism of Netanyahu, and I hope that genuine Christianity is not the Spanish Inquisition, and so it goes on. I think that there are very few religions which are intrinsically full of horror. I mean, the Aztec religion in ancient Latin America, before it became Latin,
with
of
human
course.
sacrifices.
Yeah, but that was part of the religion, and
Yeah,
they would capture warriors in other tribes and sacrifice them to the sun god. Now, I would call that a pretty pathological religion, but I would say the major religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have a benign or humanistic side, which would actually make.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Peaceful. They are peaceful religions.
Yeah. They. I mean, for example, at the base of Sikhism, there is a theoretically a love of all humanity, for example, but that doesn't stop there being Sikh terrorists who actually will kill and bring down aeroplanes to create their own homeland. So I think that what happens is that when there are genuine, if you like, ethnic or communal problems in a religious society, the struggle for justice will take a religious form. But if it's taking place in a secularized society, it will take a secular form. I mean, if you take the modern West, which is immensely secularized, so it still has churches, but it's not a religion, not a society based on religion. So someone like Breivik in Norway, for him it was natural to see the his anti-Islamism, not in a radical form of Christianity, but in an ethnic sense, in a sense of the threat to Norwegianness or the Aryanness or whiteness, and he brought Christianity into that. Because Christianity for him has lost its religious value and is a cultural force. It's a cultural Christianity. Just like for many Jews, Judaism is a cultural force and no longer a religious force. So if you are tempted by extremism in a secularized society, your terrorism or extremism will be secular. And if it takes place within a religion-dominated society, it will tend to be a form of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism. But there is no way that religion is always a form of terrorism, unless you call all forms of extreme belief religious. But I think that's a misuse of the word.
Mr. Griffin, in your opinion, what must be the role of the government in the countering and fighting or maybe battling terrorism? How important is international cooperation in this context?
Well, it's interesting that you use the word government, because in the West, we tend to use the word government as a positive term. But of course, what I've been saying today really emphasizes the fact that there are governments in this world today, and there is probably a dominant number of governments in this world today, which are not committed to human values or humanistic values or social ideals. They are institutions of control, oppression, and suppression. And therefore, if you go to an autocratic society like China, there is very little terrorism there because they still use beheading and secret police and massive surveillance. And if you asked somebody in Iran, where you have thought police and dress police, I mean, this is pure George Orwell, this wonderful English socialist who wrote a book called 1984. And he anticipated the surveillance society of, say, Stasi or modern China in his Big Brother concept, yeah? So if you're in a non-democratic society, and by democratic, I mean liberal democratic, that means a democracy committed, not like Netanyahu or Viktor Orban or Trump, to nationalism or really bad values, but a liberal, socialistic, humanistic values. If you're in an anti-democratic, anti-liberal government society, then your countering terrorism will be massive, and it will be based not on humane legislation and humane actions, but on use of violence, of torture and imprisonment without a trial. And take somebody like Netanyahu. Netanyahu was sorry, I'm talking about Navalny. Navalny in Russia was arrested and killed in prison by Putin for defending democratic values. But of course, officially, he was a terrorist. He was an anti-government, anti-Russian terrorist.
I'm sorry. So according to the state's point of view, he was the terrorist. And at the same time, according to the point of view, according to the position of those utterance of his, he was the leader, the hero, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're a Democrat, you see, what I've learned in the last few years is we've got to be very careful about the word democracy, because Israel is a democracy, but it's committing war crimes on a daily basis and atrocities. And I don't call it genocide because that's a complicated term, but it's certainly destroying a people. It's culture side. It's destroying a people's culture. So we can't just use the word democracy. We have to say liberal democracy. A liberal democratic government has a duty to keep its population safe, but not by using anti-human techniques of arresting people without trial, etc., etc. I mean, imprisoning people without a trial. And they obviously have a massive need for surveillance and counter-terrorist actions by secret police, by secret agencies, etc., but also a genuinely liberal democratic government or social democratic government has a massive duty to pour energy into and resources into education, to create civic values, to actually make sure that educational standards are high, that social standards are high, because bad social conditions, living conditions, can generate extremism out of despair. So a healthy Scandinavian government like Sweden, for example, which still has problems of racism, it still has problems of extremism and xenophobia, but it can do an awful lot to create tolerance and to marginalize extremism. But a government that actually is in the hands of a criminal like Trump can actually encourage extremism, encourage the Christian right, which is extremely anti-democratic in America, encourage the neo-fascist and conspiracy theorist type extremism, which is all over America and which is actually encouraged by Trump. So a government has an extraordinary responsibility for minimizing extremism and terrorism, or actually making it worse. And as for international cooperation, it's extremely important at the level of counterterrorism that there is massive international cooperation at the level of surveillance and sharing knowledge, but also in trying to work towards a better world ecologically and socially and economically in terms of distribution of wealth. Because if you can imagine a sustainable future world with minimal poverty and high educational and health standards, then of course the conditions, the habitat for extremism and terrorism would be reduced.
So, sir, in this case, could you name some of those countries who have successfully dealt with extremism and terrorism inside, so domestically have resolved this issue?
Yeah. Well, I could give you a good example from my own experience as an Englishman. I'm old. I'm going to be 77 in January, and when I was young, I grew up in southern England that most people believed were at war with the terrorist organization called the IRA. We were never taught the history. We were never taught why these people believed that Northern Ireland was part of the Irish island, that the whole island should be Irish. But so they were just demonized as terrorists, full stop, no explanation. And all the state terror being used by the British Army in Northern Ireland was kept secret, the murders and the killings, etc. So that's a good example of the ambiguity of the word terrorism. But then the magic happened, and under the Tony Blair government, this is before he took us into an illegal war in the Gulf, but he did do one good thing in Ireland. He was part of the initiative to get the two sides, the pro-British Northern Irish and the anti-British Northern Irish, together, and they eventually created a treaty which has generally held, which has turned Northern Ireland into a peaceful society. And that was done through a mixture. And it wasn't done through counterterrorism. It was not done by the use of the army or by surveillance or by some terrible use of state terror. It was done through negotiation and the sympathetic individuals involved. There are American politicians involved like Clinton, there was Blair, and there were some very heroic people in Ireland on both sides, especially some fantastic women who were terrified that their children would be shot dead, either by the British Army or by a terrorist or whatever. And together, a new mood emerged, which meant that there was enough momentum and goodwill for, on the symbolic day of Good Friday in the Christian calendar, a new treaty was arranged. And as a result of that, Northern Ireland the terrorism was marginalized and basically, apart from a few attacks, disappeared. And now the Sinn Féin movement, which originally was branded a terrorist movement, is now the dominant faction, the dominant political party in Northern Ireland. So it's a remarkable story of how what looks like an impossible polarization, which is breeding terrorism, can actually be dealt with. Meanwhile, in Britain, now we have parties like the Reform Party and the extreme right of the Conservative Party, who are xenophobic and who treat migrants in a way which dehumanizes them, and they are encouraging indirectly right-wing terrorism, and in some ways they're also encouraging Islamist terrorism, though Islamist terrorism is now highly marginalized. So governments have a major role to play. If you want to think of societies with minimal terrorism, they're all societies where, in fact, there's never really been, they haven't dealt with the problem. There hasn't been a major problem. Countries like Canada, Sweden, Britain, there are the odd, sorry, not Britain, Scandinavian countries generally, and Canada and Switzerland, and whoa, I can't think of many where there has never really been, and if anything, the problem has only emerged in the last 10 years because of the rise of migration or the rise of Muslim population. So it's really it's not so much the success of governments in dealing with problems, but not having problems in the first place. In the British case, though, it does show that if there is enough government political will, then you can actually have a proper initiative. But as long as governments continue to marginalize ethnic minorities and religious minorities and do nothing to address major social issues, then you will always have some form of extremism bubbling along in society, which will erupt occasionally, even into mini wars, as has happened in some of the post-Soviet republics.
So, Mr. Griffin, the last question of mine will be associated with all those measures that could be undertaken on international level by various countries, by various maybe alliances in order to counter, in order to battle the international terrorism and extremism. I do mean the measures that could be undertaken by the majority of civilized countries. So what could be their steps on this issue?
Well, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, to be in a world where the world imagined by the creators of the United Nations and the people who wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, the world they foresaw was of an international community committed to basic human values of all human beings, independent of religion or culture or history or whatever. And if that world had emerged, it would be wonderful to think of an international policy and body which agreed on definitions of what extremism is, that agreed that, for example, if you protest against the Chinese government in Hong Kong, simply to give them more democratic rights, you do not get, as happened last week, 10 years of terrible imprisonment in mainland China. But unfortunately, the conditions for genuine international agreement on these things do not exist. There was a moment in the Balkans when the United Nations showed some efficiency in countering the ethnic cleansing, and mind you, very late in the day, atrocities were committed. But that's a rare example of successful intervention by United Nations. And now the United Nations is almost impotent. Look at its failure to deal. It's just unable to deal with what Netanyahu is doing or what Putin is doing. And now we've got a president coming into America in January who's like a rogue state in himself. So I'm not very optimistic about international policies. There is already quite a lot of international communication and data sharing between private, secret agencies in many countries. There's a lot of data sharing about criminality and extremism and terrorism, but probably not enough. But in a world which is so fragmented and so polarized and so full of massive issues, like which I could list them to, I cannot really imagine what they could agree. Even the small number of countries with healthy ideas about extremism and terrorism, I don't really know what they could do. I think the main initiative, if you're in Azerbaijan, for example, is to have a sober look at the sources of extremism, the nature of extremisms, the role played by factors which the government or the international community could do something about. And if there was some sort of a consensus, but you need a small number of real idealists, really committed and risking often their lives to get together to push the politics of the country in a certain direction. But at the heart of all initiatives lies a certain dream which can be shared by religious believers and non-religious believers of a civic society, a civil society, which believes genuinely in the rights of the children, in the rights of the right to be free of poverty, of all the fundamental rights which were listed in that magnificent document of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a magnificent document. And I'm afraid that as the history goes on, it becomes more and more of a dream, but a dream which can still inspire wonderful behavior and actions and idealists even today. But in each country, the problems are different, and the cluster, the combination of problems is different. So you need a mixture of deep knowledge and deep idealism, and you can at least dedicate your life to making a benign difference and not to destruction and hatred.
Mr. Griffin, thank you so much for your time and this great knowledge that you have shared with us. Thank you so much. So this
can I just say, we don't need knowledge, we need love. Love is more
Thank
powerful.
you so much for your love and passion.
If you have love, you will find the knowledge. So
Absolutely.
Can I just say via your network that we need idealists like you and your program, and that everybody can be an idealist and everybody can have the heart. So it's not about academic knowledge, it's about the knowledge of the heart. And I wish you all very well.
Thank you so much. In this case, we have to have love in order to have knowledge.
Yes, well, we need love to have the right knowledge.
Right knowledge.
When we have love and the right knowledge, we have the right action.
Thank you so much. So this was Mr. Griffin, who has shared his brilliant and deep knowledge with us and has given a very interesting answers to our not simple questions. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. And I wish you all very well.
Thank you so much. The same to you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.